Okay, it seems like we have enough people in to get started. So, hello everyone. We're so glad to have you here for today's program. My name is Jake Worry, and I serve as the programs manager for the DC Preservation League. I'm joined today by our presenter, Jake Flack from Ford's Theater, and by my coworker, Zachary Burt, who is running the live stream on Facebook. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are Washington, D.C.'s citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I have a few things to go over before we get started. First, I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTAC Rock, Douglas Development Corporation, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Antunovich Associates, Buyer Blinder Bell, EHT Traceries Inc., and KCE Structural Engineers. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. Moving on, just a few notes about how today's webinar is going to work. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box, which is found at the bottom of your screen. You can ask your questions anytime through the program, and we'll go through those at the end. The chat will not be available during the presentation, but towards the end, I'll turn it on. So if you have comments or want to, submit something, you're welcome to do so. For those joining on Facebook, if you submit your comment in the questions section, Zach will send it our way over here on Zoom. So those are our housekeeping items. And with that, I am ready to introduce you to our speaker today. Jake Flack serves as the Deputy Director of Education at Ford's Theater. Mr. Flack oversees the Student Visit Program with a special focus on District of Columbia public school students and teachers. In addition, he oversees the Summer Professional Development Programs, Civil War Washington, and the Seat of War and Peace, which brings teachers from around the country to Washington to learn about Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Prior to joining Ford's in 2008, Mr. Flack taught U.S. history for 5 years in the New Orleans public schools. As a native Washingtonian and K-12 graduate of DC Public Schools, Mr. Flack has a particular interest in engaging local students and teachers in the legacy of Abraham Lincoln and Civil War Washington. So we're really excited to have you here today, Jake, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Shay. Thank you for that nice introduction and also for the kind invitation to have me today. I'm really excited to spend an hour with all of you talking about Civil War Washington. And I think, as Shay mentioned, there's going to be time at the end for questions or comments. I'll try and answer the questions. Definitely won't know everything, but I'll make something up if I don't know it. So it'll be fun that way. Anyway, we're starting out with a composite image that shows Ford's Theater as it looks today and as it looked in 1865. And so you can sort of see on the right-hand side of the photograph, that's the original 1865 image blended with how the streetscape looks today. And it's actually a really nice example of historic preservation, the way that the facade of the theater has been preserved, maintained, and sort of incorporated into the contemporary landscape. So today we're going to be talking about sort of the effect the system war had on the built environment of
Jake?
Washington.
Sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. Are you like on your microphone or anything?
Yeah.
I've had a few people.
Okay. So can you hear that okay?
It's kind of echoing. I'm not sure exactly.
Okay. You know what? Let me just quickly move to my other computer.
Okay.
I'll be back in like 2 seconds.
Okay. I'll entertain everybody. I actually don't have anything entertaining to share. I can tell you about our next webinar, which is happening next month in December. We'll be doing a webinar about the Foggy Bottom Historic District, and it'll be about a house history map, which 2 residents created that will share about how they created the map and all of the different histories that are located in that neighborhood, which should be pretty interesting, or at least I think so. We'll have a few other events that month as well for our members. If you're not a DCPL member, you should consider joining. It's $55 for the year, and you get exclusive access to a lot of our events and our annual meeting, which is super fun. So that's my entertainment for for all of you.
Perfect timing. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it sounds better.
Good. It wouldn't be a webinar if there wasn't a glitch, and it wouldn't be a webinar if the glitch wasn't caused by me. So again, I apologize, everybody.
No worries.
Let's take a look at our beautiful city today. You can see this map is illustrating all of the wonderful neighborhoods in Washington, and it gives us a good sense of the size and the scale of the city today. But what we're going to focus on really is just this small area. And if I move my cursor, Shay, can you see that? Okay, so we're just going to focus on sort of the central part of downtown Washington, because that is all that existed during the Civil War. This is a map of what Washington looked like. And you'll notice a few things that are very interesting about this map. Number one, this northern street was called Boundary Street. Obviously, it was called Boundary Street because it was the northern boundary of the city. So everything above that was just farmland. And that street is still there today. Today, we call it Florida Avenue. So if you are familiar with where Florida Avenue is in relation to downtown, gives you a good idea of just how small the city was. And over, just to orient you, we have the Capitol here and the White House, the National Mall. This is the Smithsonian Castle, and Ford's Theater would be right about here, right there. And then we have the separate city of Georgetown, which wasn't even technically part of Washington, not until the 1870s. So the other thing I want to point out about this map that's really interesting is the width of the Potomac River. It looks really wide, and that's because it was. It was a lot wider than it is today. Much of the Potomac River, in fact, all of East and West Potomac parks were landfills. So they dredged the river and increased the size of the city. That's where the Lincoln Memorial is, of course. And that's where this was. This is called the Jefferson Pier Stone. And I'm sure you can tell, but off to the upper right is the Washington Monument. That was the edge of the river at the time when Thomas Jefferson was president. And in an effect to sort of establish U.S. Dominance and significance and move away from England, Jefferson wanted the prime meridian moved to Washington. And so this stone actually marks, it goes all the way up 16th Street. And that's why it's called Meridian Hill Park today. So that didn't happen, but the pier stone was rededicated and re-erected in 1889. I just want to point out that one of the reasons that Washington during the Civil War was so dangerous was simply because of where it was located. This is a map actually that Abraham Lincoln consulted and had in his office, and it's based on the 1860 census, and it shows every state that had the institution of slavery, and it shows every county within every state, and it shows the enslaved population of each county. And so the darker the shading, the higher percentage of the overall people in that county were held in slavery. So immediately we can sort of, if you even sort of look back and blur your eyes, the darkest part, one of the darkest parts is right here. And of course, that's the Mississippi River. So this is the Mississippi Delta right here. Some of these counties in Mississippi were 80, 82, 85%, and as high as 92% of all the people in the county were held in slavery. But if we look up to where Washington is, what I find interesting, first of all, is that the nation's capital, DC, is completely surrounded by slaveholding states. So already that is working against Lincoln when he shows up in 1861. But if you do sort of a deeper dive into the surrounding counties, what surprised me was that the counties in Maryland actually had a higher percentage of slavery than the ones in Virginia. And I think that we sort of tend to oversimplify. Maryland was a border state. They were pretty happy to go along with Lincoln and his policies, but they really weren't, especially around DC. And so when John Wilkes Booth, after he assassinates Lincoln, starts his escape, he's going through Charles County, Maryland, down here. But this is a great tool that we use with teachers and students because it also it also gives a good perspective on possibly certain areas investment in slavery versus non-investment, both economical, but also in terms of backing the cause. So you'll see slavery, where West Virginia was formed, all in the Appalachian Valley, was very low percentage. Okay, so back to DC. Lincoln shows up. The city he comes to is, first of all, as we've established, dangerous because of where it's located. The country is literally falling apart. There's a lot of talk about our political division today. It's nothing compared to what it was like in 1861. And then the city itself is really small and it's really undeveloped and it's very unsanitary. This, of course, is the capital with the unfinished dome, and that dome would not be completed until 1863. And then you'll notice this body of water in front of the canal, in front of the Capitol, and that was a canal. This canal was originally built to connect the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. It was going to be used for trade and commerce. But really, with the prominence of the C&O Canal and the rise in railroad technology, this Washington City Canal, by the time of the 1860s, was essentially an open sewer. They would throw dead animals in it, human waste, trash, and it was just this putrid, especially in the summertime, basically just this breeding ground for insect-borne diseases, and it stunk. So that is sort of an overview of what the city looked like. This canal, if you've ever wondered why there is this house on the National Mall, that is the lock keeper's house. And that's actually where the person who collected the tolls for the lock that was there, the canal tolls, lived. And Constitution Avenue, this is on Constitution Avenue, as you can see, right at the edge of the National Mall. And Constitution Avenue is actually where this canal was. It was basically built over the Tiber Creek, and it's still an existing waterway. And in some of the basements, some of the federal building basements along Constitution Avenue, they have these drains where you can actually see water running underneath. I've never seen that, but I would love to. I've heard about that. Anyway, this is a National Park Service site, and just recently, I think last year or maybe 2 years ago, they sort of reimagined the interpretation inside this very small museum. And it's a great, great little spot. It's got a really advanced audio visual presentation that sort of uses the mall to tell the history of Washington. It's fascinating. I would suggest, if you haven't been down there yet, check that out. And of course, this is our contemporary city, and what these yellow lines are showing is the location of this canal. So it's coming down Constitution Avenue, and then it's coming briefly up Pennsylvania Avenue, and all the way east. I'm not exactly sure if it ever fully connected to the Anacostia River or not. I need to look into that. I don't think it did. So I'm not sure where it ended, but I do love this picture because it really gives us a great scale of the downtown area today. All right, so this is another image from 1862. And I chose this to show the unfinished Capitol dome. There are the iconic photograph of Lincoln giving his first inaugural address on March 4th, 1861. And he's standing in front of this unfinished Capitol, and it's such a great metaphor for the work that he had to do to sort of complete the country. And he insisted that the work on the dome continue. But this church in the foreground that we see is the Trinity Episcopal Church, this is 3rd and Indiana Avenue today. So the church is basically located where the Metropolitan Police Department headquarters are. So I think that the photographer set up his or her camera on maybe the roof of City Hall, which is where Judiciary Square is today. I've been trying to figure out, and maybe I think that would have been the tallest building around then. Anyway, but you can't really see it, but if you look closely along the, let's see, that would be the northern side lawn. That's cattle. Those are cows grazing, and they are there to feed the Union Army. Were basically when the mall was basically a Civil War camp. Sadly, I think I'm right that that church was torn down in the 1930s, but it looks magnificent. But this photo really gives you the scale of like, okay, there are a few big buildings. One of them's under construction, but the rest of the city just sort of looks like this, dirt roads, little one-story buildings. Again, another one. This is after the Capitol dome is completed. And we see the dirt roads again. There were no paved roads. You can see a horse carriage here. So along with that canal, and imagine the thousands of horses in the city and the manure in the streets and the lack of there was no sewer system, and so the city was just really, really unsanitary. So now we know that it's dangerous because of where it is. It's small, it's undeveloped, it's unsanitary, and it's about to experience a huge population boom right when the Civil War starts. And there were really the population triples in the 4 years of the war. So it's about 60,000 in 1861, and then by 1865, it's 180,000. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the three sort of main groups of people who were coming into the city. And the first were these guys, soldiers. So basically, right after Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers. Many of them head for Washington. Basically, Washington is the front line of the Civil War. Remember, it's right across the Potomac from Virginia. So it's the gateway into the seceded states. So the logical thing is for the soldiers to arrive in Washington. Well, they didn't really have there was no infrastructure. They didn't have any barracks. They didn't have any place to live. So a few thousand of them actually lived in the Capitol, and this is the Capitol still under construction. You know, shortly after Lincoln's inauguration, this is probably like May of 1861, and they eventually they're living in camps along the National Mall, and I think this is such a really interesting photograph. Here's another one showing some artillery officers posing in front of the unfinished Washington Monument in the upper left. And construction of the monument stopped actually before the war. And I think the whole thing wasn't finished till the late 1870s or early 1880s. But in this photograph, the unfinished monument is 150 feet tall. And you can see a flag right here. There are actually accounts of soldiers, excuse me, who would the Signal Corps, the unit of the Army that communicated through various signaling methods. One of them was by communicating with flags, and that was actually when the war starts. That was one of the main ways that they were able to communicate with Fort Stevens up in the northern part of the city, which we'll talk about shortly. But so as these soldiers are living on the mall, they're going in and out of the unfinished monument, and one of them, a soldier from New York named D.C. Hickey, basically carves his name inside the Washington Monument. So I know the D.C. Preservation League and Ford Theater, we definitely don't advocate for graffiti, but when it's saved by a Civil War soldier, it's pretty interesting. And I have a friend, a park ranger friend, who works on the National Mall, and she did some research into who D.C. Hickey was, and it turns out I think he was from New York. Is that what it says? I think he's from New York or Pennsylvania. Anyway, he's captured and he dies in the Andersonville prison camp. So this is kind of like a fitting tribute to Private Hickey. Of course, the monument today, you can see when they resumed construction, the stones came from a a different quarry than the original 150 feet. And so that's why it's slightly two different shades of marble. And today it's 555 feet tall, exactly. This, of course, is the White House in the upper right of the photograph. And I believe the photographer here was set up on that unfinished Washington Monument and is looking north. And what we see, we can see evidence of the canal. Right here is the canal. You can see boats with masts in there. And then you can see all of the cattle that were being stored on the mall to feed this growing army that was massing in Washington, getting ready to head into the first land battles of the Civil War, which would take place just 30 miles away in Manassas, Virginia. So imagine, like, if you're in the White House, there's no air conditioning. It's July, all the windows are open, and a few hundred yards away are a couple 100,000 head of cattle and this putrid canal. It's a large reason why the Lincoln family spent their summers up at President Lincoln's cottage, which is on the grounds of the soldiers' home, to escape just sort of this disease stench. It's up on the ridge up in Petworth, where there's a breeze. If you've ever been to the old soldiers' home, which now is officially called the Armed Forces Retirement Home. If you have not been to President Lincoln's cottage, it's probably my favorite museum in the city. It's awesome. It's the interpretation's really interesting because they don't fill the house with artifacts. They fill it with Lincoln's ideas, and the way that they do those exhibits is really interesting. Little plug for the cottage. So we have soldiers moving in, about 20,000 originally, and then along with the sort of the growing war, we have people moving to Washington to work in this growing wartime economy. So people are literally flooding in to work in industries that are equipping the army. They're building cannons in the Washington Arsenal and the Navy Yard, as well as other sorts of munitions. Journalists are coming to cover the war. Hotels are opening, restaurants are opening, saloons and bars. There's just a lot of people coming in. It's interesting because the Civil War is like the first example of war being really good for the DC economy specifically, and we definitely saw that with the defense contractors, particularly along the Dulles Corridor during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Just all of the government spending that's centered here in Washington. So all these people are coming to live and work in that environment. So one of the things that they need for all these people are theaters to entertain them. So this is Ford's Theater, which opened during the Civil War in response to this population boom. And this shows sort of the scale of downtown. This is 10th Street. And this was the part of our composite image that we kicked off with. So yeah, the theater opens, and a lot of boarding houses open too. People move in, they don't, they're not living in their own house. Seasonal government workers needed places to stay just for parts of the year. And so boarding houses downtown were very prevalent. Here is the Smithsonian Castle. So there's a really interesting diary that was kept by a young woman who lived in the castle. Her name was Mary Henry, and she was the daughter of Joseph Henry, who was I don't know what the exact title was, the director of the Smithsonian or the chairman or whatever it was, the head honcho. And Mary keeps this diary of what Washington was like during the war. So she talks about hearing the cannons at Fort Stevens in July of 1864. She talks about all of the soldiers heading down in July of 1861 to fight in the first Battle of Bull Run. And then she talks sadly about how so many of them were brought back on stretchers, wounded, and placed in these makeshift hospitals that sprung up all over the city. So it's a fascinating document if you're ever interested in sort of like you don't get too many women's perspectives on what the war was like anywhere, let alone in Washington. So it's the Diary of Mary Henry. Here's another shot. See where this camera would be. I chose this just because it gives sort of the barren scope of downtown and the National Mall. And of course, today you can see it's so much more built up and developed. Okay, so our third group of people who come to Washington, particularly after April 11th, 1862, are African Americans who are basically fleeing slavery. So as you know, I'm sure, uh, slavery is banned in Washington 9 months before the Emancipation Proclamation. And I'm sure that you also know, as Washingtonians, that our city is often used by federal lawmakers to test policy, to test national policy. We're sort of like a testing ground, right? So Lincoln was interested in exploring options for how slavery might end. And one of the first ideas was to what was called compensated emancipation. And basically that's what happened in Washington. Compensated emancipation meant that if you were an enslaver in Washington, you could go down to the courthouse, you could go down to City Hall at Judiciary Square, sign an oath of allegiance to the United States of America, list the people that you enslaved, their age, their physical characteristics, and their value. And then they had slave traders evaluate people. I mean, it's hard to read about, but basically the people were freed, but they didn't receive anything, and the enslavers received money. So that was the first sort of test on how ending slavery would work, and that emancipated close to 4,000 people in Washington. Well, what happened was obviously other people would flee their situations of enslavement, particularly in Maryland and Virginia, and flood into the city because it offered this protection. Hey, now the Union Army's there. They've passed this law that slavery's outlawed. And so about 40,000 African Americans stream into the city. Well, they have nowhere to live. They have no money. They have, in most cases, no education. And so it became a critical situation. And so the response was to build these camps that were called contraband camps. And the first one of those, or one of the first ones, was down near U Street. And the problem was, so many people were moving in that they had a really bad cholera outbreak. And so they needed an area that was sort of cleaner, where the air was cleaner. And so they went across the river and they built Freedman's Village on Robert E. Lee's plantation, Arlington. And so actually this is Freedman's Village. And Freedman's Village, once Lee resigned his commission in the United States Army and joined the Confederate Army, they marched across the bridge and took over his estate and turned it into this, and then into a cemetery. So we have soldiers, we have people coming for the wartime economy, we have people fleeing slavery, and this is the mix of what's happening in Civil War Washington. I will say that a lot of these camps became historic neighborhoods over time after emancipation, particularly the areas around like Fort Reno and Fort Stevens. They were longstanding African American communities that were started because of the Civil War. Oops. And of course, after the Emancipation Proclamation, which was really a military document that said that Black men could fight for their own freedom, about 180,000 Black soldiers join the Union Army, basically turn the tide of the war. So one of the big misconceptions that we run into here is people will say, "Oh, the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery," which is just not true at all, because it didn't actually free anybody. It said, "Hey, if you're in a state in rebellion, being held in slavery, you're free." Well, who's going to listen to that down south? And so, but what it did do is allowed black men to fight for their own freedom. And so this is Fort Lincoln in Washington. Um, this is like a commemorative photo that was taken right after the war. And one thing I love about this photograph. There's an inset. I should have included it, but someone made like a really high res inset of the soldiers' faces, and you can just see like the determination and the confidence that they have. Um, it's really powerful. And I also love this line right here, which of course lets you know that this was made from a glass plate negative. So the negative cracked, which was pretty common. Probably in the wagon home to the photographer's studio. I'm not sure if this was a James Brady or not. I don't think it was, or Alexander Gardner. But anyway, you can see the cracked negative. Okay, we're getting off the built environment and into photography. Sorry, Shay. Okay, so another way that the city was dramatically affected by the Civil War was by the system of forts that were built to protect it. So when we saw the soldiers in front of the Capitol, many of them probably headed into the first Battle of Bull Run, which is just down in Manassas, Virginia. And that was basically a disaster for the United States Army. They got crushed. And they called it the Great Skedaddle. The soldiers are literally running back into Washington. And the city's completely undefended. So they spent the first year and a half constructing this ring of forts around the city. So what these blue stars indicate is the location of each of the forts. And the forts were staffed by ultimately about 40,000 soldiers. And so you can see, just to point out, here's the White House and here's the Capitol. This where it says U.S. Military Asylum, that's actually the soldiers' home where President Lincoln's cottage is. And then, of course, we have Arlington right across the river. Anyway, all of these forts are built. The way that they're constructed is by large dirt walls and then some wooden buildings inside barracks and things like that. And mostly, if they could be, they were built on the high ground. There's a natural sort of ridge that surrounds Washington, whether it's Arlington or up at the soldiers' home. There's this natural ridge, but you'll notice that most of the forts are built along the southern border of the city. Well, why is that? Well, they think that the Confederate attack, will come from the south, right? And that was really the main goal of each side, was to capture each other's capital. That's why most of the Civil War is fought between Washington and Richmond, Virginia. And the attack did come. Washington was attacked. There was one Civil War battle in Washington, and it happened in July 11th and 12th, 1864. And Confederate General Jubal Early, in an effort to relieve, so the Union by 1864 was really getting close to attacking Richmond, and there was a lot of pressure on Petersburg and Richmond. And so General Robert E. Lee says, okay, let's take some pressure off this by sending an army to invade the North and threaten the capital, Washington. So this General Jubal Early and his 12,000 man army comes up through the Shenandoah Valley and then crosses the Potomac River, sort of ramsacks Frederick, and then they head south down basically what is Rockville Pike, to attack Washington. And they attacked at Fort Stevens, which is still a preserved battlefield on roughly 13th and Piney Branch Road, so sort of where Piney Branch and Georgia intersect. It's a National Park Service site, wildly underfunded, if you ask me. But it was a critical Civil War battle because they could have just overrun these loosely manned forts. The most trained soldiers and the most equipment was down in the south. Fort Stevens was staffed largely by invalid soldiers, office clerks, literally anybody who could hold a rifle. And so they could have easily overrun Fort Stevens and then just marched down and captured the capital. And maybe that would have been the end of the Civil War. But what happened instead was they were delayed by a day in Monocacy, in the Battle of Monocacy, and they were slowed down. So within that extra day, they were able to, by ship, bring a ton of soldiers up from the Richmond area, and they were able to repel this attack. And this is actually one of the forts. This is Fort Totten, which of course, another legacy, the contemporary legacy of the Civil War is a lot of these forts are places still, like Fort Totten. Of course, you don't see the metro anywhere, but this is what it looked like. This really illustrates what these forts looked like. They put cannons up on the tops of these earthen walls, and they would clear cut orchards and woods around. So there's a lot of people lost their farms and their land. So this is the fort directly east of Fort Stevens. And then this is Fort Stevens today. There's actually still a few cannons there. It was sort of refurbished during the New Deal in the 1930s. But this stone, this large stone with the plaque on it, was erected in the 1920s by soldiers who fought in the Battle of Fort Stevens. And Abraham Lincoln came up from the soldiers' home and watched the battle. And he stood right where that rock is. So you can go stand next to where Lincoln was standing. And basically between this fort and Walter Reed, even into Silver Spring, that was the battlefield. It stretched all the way up past Walter Reed. But Lincoln actually got shot at as he was standing on this wall, and the soldier next to him got shot in the leg and survived. And they pulled Lincoln down, realizing that he was in some serious danger, and got him out of there quickly. But I think this is one of the most important places in American history, I'd say. I'm biased. Back at Fort, this is Ford's Theater, the night of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, which was April 14th, 1865, after Robert E. Lee had surrendered. And you can see Lincoln's being carried out of the theater. And there were many soldiers, some medical doctors some Army doctors in the theater that night, and a few of them were able to get to Lincoln. They realized he was not going to survive, and so they just wanted to take him out and get him to the closest bed. And that happened to be in a boarding house across the street, owned by a German family called the Petersons. Again, there were no hospitals downtown, really, and with these dirt roads, the option of taking him back the 5 blocks to the White House on a bumpy dirt road in a horse carriage probably would have proved fatal, and they did not want him to die in a horse carriage. And so they were really just looking for the closest bed to sort of make him comfortable and attend to his wounds. And the Peterson boarding house is interesting, less for what, I don't know. I mean, of course it's important because it's where Lincoln died, but to me, it's a really interesting illustration of the wartime economy, because everybody who lived in that boarding house was somehow working in this vibrant wartime economy. I guess I should show this one first. This is Willie Clark, and he was a clerk in the Union Army. He'd been in the Army. He was basically doing office work. 23 years old. He lived in the Peterson house. He actually lived in the room that Lincoln dies in. And the night of April 14th, when Lincoln is shot in Ford's Theater, they bring him into Willie Clark's room. It's on the first floor. You can still see it. It's part of our museum. And Willie Clark is out all night partying, basically. Out all night, which we never recommend here. But he comes back the next day to be told that the president of the United States has just died in his bed, and they've removed his body and taken it back to the White House. And so his his room becomes all of a sudden, in an instant, this very public space, and people want to see where the president lived. They want to steal stuff out of the room for souvenirs. They want to take their pen knives and chip off pieces of wallpaper. And so he writes this letter to his sister on April 19th. So just 4 days after Lincoln dies, describing what it's like to live in this now very public place, and how he's going to have someone guard his room. But I think I always like to show this to students because you can kind of see how he got his job writing letters in the Army. His handwriting is just beautiful. And kids love this. Plus, he describes some of the gory stuff that was left behind, including a piece of linen that he said had a piece of Lincoln's brain on it. So I don't know what happened to that. This is Willie Clark. So he's working in this wartime industry. There were two brothers who had a portrait studio named the Uhlke brothers. They were German immigrants. There were a lot of German immigrants in the area where Ford's is. For political reasons, I don't really know much about, but there was a revolutionary period, and there was a huge German migration in 1848, and so Washington developed this heavily German neighborhood. The Peterson family who owned this house were Germans. There were the Uhlke brothers who lived in there were Germans. One of them was a painter named Henry, and they had a portrait studio on Pennsylvania Avenue. And basically, military army officers would often have portraits made or painted, or using the newer medium of photography. And this is Julius Uhlke's photograph of the deathbed the next day. So you can see the front door to the Peterson house is open. This is Ford's Theater. This is the transom above the front door. And Lincoln has just been carried out. This is the chair where Mary sat. So Julius takes this photograph. Henry, his brother, was a pretty accomplished painter, portrait painter, and there's a large portrait of President Ulysses S. Grant hanging in the White House today that was painted by Henry Uhlke. And then, of course, this is Ford's Theater after the assassination. We can see that the black mourning cloth is draped from the windows, showing that the theater and the city itself is in mourning. And finally, I think this is such an interesting picture. This is the Grand Review, that basically it was a parade of victorious United States soldiers in May of 1865, and some 200,000 marched in their units down Pennsylvania Avenue. So another sort of early example about how Pennsylvania Avenue so often over the years served as America's sort of official parade ground. Okay, so the theater itself went through a series of events. It basically it was taken over by the government right after the assassinations. A lot of people wanted it burned down because something terrible had happened there, and they didn't want plays to continue there. So the theater buys it from the Ford brothers and turns it into a number of different things. One, by the 1890s, it was being used as an office building for federal workers who were working on pension records. So 20 years after the war, 2 million people serve in the United States Army. There's just hundreds of thousands of pensions have to be dealt with. And so this is one of the places where they were doing that. They built this subfloor to accommodate more workers, and this collapsed, killing 22 people in 1893, 95 or 93. And so it leads to like all of these sort of like early DC office building codes were a result of this tragedy of Ford's Theater. The contractor was sued. It's interesting building history. It's like one of the first examples of building code law as a result of this. And then after that, it goes through a series of sort of storage, and parts of it were used for a museum. And it wasn't until 1968 when the National Park Service, actually the Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, said, you know what, it's time to make this a museum. And he teamed up with a woman named Frankie Hewitt, who started the Ford's Theater Society. And she said, well, if we just, rebuild it as it was that night, it'll sort of always be a tribute to John Wilkes Booth. So what we need to do is have theater and plays, because that's what Lincoln loved. And so that's why today we are a museum, a historic site, but also a working theater to sort of maintain Lincoln's love of theater and to, as we say, celebrate the American experience. So with that, I will stop and see if anybody has any questions.
Yes, so remember, if you want to submit a question, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom, or you can put it into the chat, which I've just opened up for you. But we do have one question already, which is about your photographs, kind of just where you're getting most of those, and where or what are some of the resources in DC for people who might be interested in doing their own Civil War research.
Yeah, so the two that I would suggest, well, first of all, the DC History Center um, is just an awesome place to go for so many things, but they have a great research room. But probably like close to 100% of the photographs that I used for this come from the Library of Congress. Library of Congress has a huge photo archives, um, and most of them are rights free, so you can use them for different instances. But that's that we sort of have an embarrassment of research riches in this city. We have the National Archives, the Library of Congress, the DC History Center, and on and on. So it's really an amazing place if you are interested in doing research to be.
Great. So do you know who was Ford's Theater named after?
So Ford Theater was named for the two brothers that owned it, who were named Ford, John T. Ford and Harry Ford. So many people often think it's related to Henry Ford, but it is not. But ironically, Henry Ford purchased the rocking chair that Lincoln was sitting in when he was assassinated, and it's in his museum at Greenfield Village. So there is a Ford connection.
Interesting. Um, this is, I have a question related to that. So, where did most of the artifacts from Lincoln's room end up? Have they been recovered
It's
or
really
still-
it's really interesting. So right after the assassination, stuff just starts going, right? And it's going to different places. Um, but a lot of it was used as evidence in the trial against the conspirators. So that means that it was in the possession of the War Department, which today we would call the Defense Department. And then that was eventually turned over to the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service. So we have many artifacts associated with the conspirators, such as like the gun that Lincoln was assassinated with, lots of different things. Many of the things we don't have, like the rocking chair, the bed that he died in is in the Chicago Historic Society Museum. It was purchased by a chewing gum magnate in like the 1870s or 80s or something. Like people were very interested in collecting anything that happened. We did have uh, at the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, we had a really cool temporary exhibit where we brought back as many things as we could, artifacts, and had them in one place. So it was the first time that all of these things had actually been together since April 14th, 1865.
Huh, that's so interesting. And I guess this question is also slightly related. Was there any attempt at the time to preserve Civil War elements of DC, or was the focus on moving forward, forgetting? And so, kind of, how did some of the physical spaces, maybe forts, end up getting preserved in the long run?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the forts specifically, a lot of times, well, most of them were built on private land, on farms. And so the land was returned. Uh, there's a great court case. The guy who owns the land where Fort DeRussy is, which is right next to it's in Rock Creek Park near the Rock Creek Nature Center. It's an interesting one to visit because it's in its natural state. It hasn't been preserved. But he sues the government. He's like, "Hey, you chopped down 40 acres of my orchards, and you tore up my land, and ruined my farm." And there's all these like sort of correspondence and government cases. So I think a short answer is that many different things happen to sort of the fort system, but because the city itself was so small and there were so few iconic buildings, those remain. So we have Ford's Theater, we have the Capitol, we have the White House, um, we have the Soldiers' Home, just things like that.
Yeah. And there were quite a few Civil War buildings from the preservation side that were torn down. And a great place to kind of see some of those is James Good's Capital Losses book is a
Mm,
great resource for that if you're interested.
yeah,
Some other questions for you. Could you just mention one more time the name of the museum on the mall, the Lock Keepers,
I think it's just called the Lock Keeper's House. It's
Lock
a it's
Keepers
a
House?
it's a National Park Service museum. It's not open like 40 hours a week, so I would look at they have a website. I would look to see when it's open, but I would again suggest a visit there if you're able to. It's really fun.
Right. Is there evidence that at Fort Stevens, the young Massachusetts officer Oliver Wendell Holmes actually told Lincoln, "Get down, you fool"?
I think he added a word before fool also. Um, that's according to him. There's about four different people who claim to have said that, but I'm pretty sure that he was um, abruptly taken down and removed from that situation.
Was that the only battle he ever watched over?
That's the only battle any sitting president has ever watched. Of course, many of our presidents were previous generals who were in battles, but he's the only president to ever watch an active battle.
Interesting. If Florida Avenue was the city's northern border, what did the GW surveying stones mark? I'm not sure I know what those are, but do you
Oh,
know?
the George Washington, the Pier Stone,
Mm,
or the actual. So the survey stones that are still there, they mark every mile of the 10 square mile. I think that is. So those are called boundary stones,
yeah,
and the boundary stones are still there. But that basically is the outline of the original intended city. So that's an interesting question because the city just wasn't built any farther north of Florida Avenue. I think it was just called Washington County.
yeah, I think we have an entry on the boundary stones somewhere on DC historic sites as well, uh,
Yeah.
which is a great resource. We run that DC historic sites.
Oh,
Uh,
good. I like the plug. You gotta be plugging your stuff.
yeah, of course. Speaking of which, could you tell us a bit more about Ford's Theater, their programming, how you
Sure.
it, all that sort of great stuff?
Yeah, so I mentioned that we're sort of an interesting place because we are this historic site, and we're also a working theater where we do three, sometimes four major productions every year. In the winter slot, we always do a Christmas Carol, which is kind of a Washington tradition. So that starts actually, I think it starts this weekend. It starts very soon. Um, and then we have really robust education programming. So we serve about 5,000 DC public school students a year through our field trip program and through our student matinee program, which involves us sending free buses to the schools, picking them up, bringing them here, giving them an interpretive tour. We have an oratory program that serves teachers around the country that trains teachers how to train students to develop their own voice to advocate for things. So it's public speaking. We have a lot of online stuff. We do distance learning with people all over the world, really. So there's a lot going on. And then we're also a partner of the National Park Service. So we do a lot of things with the rangers here. And so it's a really interesting blend of theater, museum, park service, and preservation, really.
Yes, it does. It's funny. It looks exactly the same, on the outside at least, as it
Yeah,
does in the photos you
yeah.
showed, which is great. Um, do you have any book recommendations for people who are interested in learning more about DC specifically during the Civil War?
Yeah, there are a number of them. There's a book called April 1865 by Jay Winnick, which is really interesting. I think it talks about sort of the danger of the Civil War. There's one called Lincoln's Citadel, which is about President Lincoln's cottage, and there's a number of different ones. Um, but I think when you're reading about that, the really important context, or one of the really important things to keep in mind, is just like how precarious the federal government was just because of where it's located. It's really like the front lines of the Civil War. So it's amazing, really amazing that this fort system held, and that just the way that circumstances unfolded, Washington survives the Civil War.
Yeah, I know we're historians, so we don't often think in the hypothetical, but how do you think it
But
would have affected the war if DC had
yeah,
gone under?
well, I mean, I could have done two things really. That remember, there was a presidential election that was about to happen that fall, and so Lincoln was literally fighting for his political life. If his capital's attacked and ransacked, um, that's not going to send a strong message to potential voters. So definitely could have affected the election, but worse, it could have the government could have collapsed and the Confederate Army could have taken control of Washington. Um, that might have ended the Civil War.
Yeah.
We might need passports today to go to Virginia, you know?
Some people act like they need a passport to go to Virginia, but so we're getting also some other book recommendations in the chat if
Oh,
you're
good.
interested. Um, but let me see if we have any other questions that can be addressed in our final 2 minutes. Um, where were the assassination conspirators hung?
Oh, that's a great question. And I didn't mention that, but that's another great Civil War related site that is still preserved, and that is Fort McNair. So they were tried and executed in DC in July of 1865 at Fort McNair. Four of them were hanged. Four of them were sentenced to long prison sentences. Um, and the courtroom is still there. It's preserved. The thing about Fort McNair, it's right next to Audi Field. It's that land where the Anacostia and the Potomac rivers meet. To get on is a little tricky because it's an active military base, but you can make arrangements to visit the courtroom where they tried the conspirators, and then right outside that building is where they were executed.
Very interesting. I didn't know it was still there, but
Yeah.
very interesting. All right, I'll ask you one more question and then I'll set you free. Someone is asking about the neighborhood map. Was that from the Library of Congress?
No, I can't remember where that came from. I think I might have just gotten that online.
Okay.
It's cool though. Okay, I'll do another plug. So we're right down the street from the annual holiday market that gets constructed in front of the portrait gallery, and it's all
Mhm.
these artists and vendors, and it's really fun. There is definitely one vendor, and I don't know this person's name or company's name, so it's not a real plug, but they do neighborhood maps and they do city maps that show all the neighborhoods. And they're really cool. And you can get them for most large cities, but they definitely have one for Washington.
Hmm.
So that artist just got free advertising, and I don't even know who they are.
It was like a hint,
Yeah,
suggestion, no clear path forward, except for the holiday market, which is great.
right.
Um, okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being here and
Sure.
for teaching us all about the Civil War. It was great. I know I really enjoyed it, and I think everybody, wow, there's a lot of book recommendations in here. I'll have to
Yeah,
check
there
some
you go.
out
Yeah, I'm
too.
sorry. Okay, great.
But yeah, well, thank you so much. And I will send out an email with some additional information from us about Ford's Theater, DC Preservation League, and we will make sure to get you the information. And the recording should be available on YouTube within a few days.
Great.
But if you have any questions, you can email me, and I will connect you with where you need to get connected.
Yeah, and if
But
anyone has questions for me, you can get my information from Shay too.
yep, perfect. All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Jake, and thank you to everyone who attended, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Okay.